what at various times he called the unpleasure principle, the pleasure principle, and even the pleasure-unpleasure principle, which is an enormous complication, which I'll try to outline next time. What I'm going to do today is awfully clear, but I'm sort of determined to do it. I remember promising you during that endless first meeting, when I gave that still not fully worked out talk on practicity, that I would never lecture to you again. But since, our next sequence of 5 seminars, sort of our second unit, is entirely on Freud, and what I want to do is a little bit intricate, I am going to read you, with your permission, you can protest if you want to, but in the center, a captive audience, a chapter, I think it's the central chapter of my book on Freud in progress. It will take, I hope, no more than half our time, perhaps a bit more. Then what will look like a crazy transition, I want us to go back to the Valentinian Gospel of Truth and look at the whole question of the reconciliation with the alien father or stranger God, as against what Freud would call the alienated or phallus mortal father, who is called the Demiurge in Gnosticism, and particularly in the Valentinian Gospel of Truth. Then I want us to look at 3 crucial passages in the Transference essays as against the primal murder or history scene in Totem and Taboo, but that will come out in the lecture that I'll begin with. So I am going to read something, then we will go on to a brief look at a Gnostic text. We can't possibly finish discussing Totem and Taboo and the Transference essays today, so I'm asking you to not only read this material and bring the general psychological theory of volume 2 next time, but bring again with you the volumes on therapy and technique and the Totem and Taboo. And now, if you'll bear with me, I do this with the greatest reluctance, but this isn't a lecture situation, and we are not a lecture group. By the way, I will probably eventually be caught in a tangle of paper, because this is one of those outrageous, I can't find my own typescript of this. What I've got is one of these mad computer printouts, because they persuaded me to contribute this to a festschrift for my old friend and former mentor, Northrop Freudian, even though he now disproves of me as a sort of mystical madman. But, so, eventually you will see me tangled in this.
Table.
What?
You just let it go off.
We'll see. Yes, buried in my own system. This is a chapter of a book on Freud. I will get serious. I will read this aloud as clearly as I can. I will probably make some interjections because I can't bear to give lectures. I've never kept to a text in my life. If there are opacities, and there will be, if you feel that you want to interrupt, you won't be interrupting. You don't even have to raise your hand. Just, throw yourself into it and ask me what I'm talking about. But I am going to start with this, and I think it explains what we are up to for the next 5 weeks anyway, and perhaps more than that. It is a chapter called Freud, Transference, Taboo, and Truth. I must tell you that I've given it 3 times on different forms. Once I start reading, my dear, I promise that in spite of my customary angst, I will read slowly. That's a very wise admonition. Especially since I seem to be unusually scattered, even for me today. I'm haunted by that Yahwistic verb, scattered. That those who are on the Tower of Babel indeed get scattered. But thank you, dear. That's actually well taken. I just wanted to say more quickly, because it's not yet text. Text is about the comic. But it is interesting, I find. I've given this 3 times as a talk, twice to Freudian analysts, and each time they came close to lynching me. So this is not acceptable, I assure you, to any current school of Freudians, whether they be American ego psychologists or impersonal psychiatrists, or those who are in any way influenced by the Lacanian mode, or those of the British Kleinian school. But I think it speaks for itself.
What was the third time?
The Kleinians, the followers of quite brilliant and quite frightening Melanie Klein, now departed. It's a very frightening theory, the Kleinian theory. All right, look, let me begin, and I will slow down, and I will try to be quiet. It is called Freud, Transference, Taboo, and Truth. And I begin with a quotation from the best of the Lacanians, far clearer, I find, but certainly not far more inventive than the great Lacan, Jean Laplanche, and I will be quoting from Geoffrey Milner's translation of the book, which in English is called Life and Death in Psychoanalysis. Jean Laplanche concludes his Life and Death in Psychoanalysis with a brief meditation upon what he finds to be most problematic in the Freudian transference. Now I'm quoting from Millman's version of La Planche. Freud made a couple of small changes in it. It was above all in its metaphorical dimension, that of as if, the als of misperception, of an error in addressee, that of course instantly invokes Lacan, of course, unposed the Purloined letter. That transference was first understood, he means understood by the Freudian community, and as a result interpreted. And I'm still quoting La Planche. And yet, think of the situation. Are we prepared to reduce the working of therapy to the generating of an illusion in order to dissipate it? Is it conceivable that its effectiveness can be reduced to so little? And that even more so nowadays, when everyone entering analysis is well aware that he or she will have a transference. This is still La Planche. If a transference takes on the dimensions of an event capable of changing something for someone, it is indeed because in one of its dimensions, the transcendence transcends the phantasmagoria to which it has occasionally been reduced. Unfortunately, La Planche has no suggestion whatsoever as to this dimension of transcendence, beyond another of those exercises and the supposed differences between metaphor and metonymy, of which the common reader rightly wearies. Yet La Planche does state one burden that must affect any rational consideration of the psychoanalytical transference. At this point, the paper is going to start going around the place. Why should it be genuinely therapeutic to generate an elusive relationship merely in order to dissipate it? Is there any analog available to us that might illuminate so odd a transaction? How has psychoanalysis won social acceptance How has psychoanalysis won social acceptance of so knowing an illusion, of so imaginary and consciously deceptive a false connection as the transference? A misleading and artificially induced infatuation is exploited in order to create a pseudo-neurosis which soon enough is real enough. And such a praxis is both applauded and indeed remunerated by civil society. Do the teachers of religion, philosophy, and the art of poetry ever transgress in any way nearly so outrageous? Karl Kraus once wickedly remarked that psychoanalysis itself was the disease of which it purported to be the cure. Is his remark truly wicked if its reference is to the cause and the cure of that imaginary illness, the transference neurosis? Freud's only mode of transcendence was what he, perhaps unjustifiably, called reality testing. What then is transcendent or true about the transference? What in the transference is other than phantasmagoria? And if, as I will insist, La Planche is mistaken, and the transference is only phantasmagoria, what kind of phantasmagoria is it? Does it belong to poetry, to religion, or is it Freud's own mythic formulation, Freud's poem on his faith as to the right use of the wrong kind of love? Finally, in this litany of questions, what truly are the dynamics of the transference? Are they what Freud asserted them to be in his papers on therapy and technique, or are we to look elsewhere in his writings for their true account? And if we are to look elsewhere, and to find what we seek, was Freud then not truthful with us? Did Freud dissimulate? The answer to all these questions will be found in the reading of Totem and Taboo, by which I hasten to add, I absolutely do not mean my reading of Totem and Taboo, but indeed in anybody's reading. Once they start with the sad, simple, and truthful translation of Totem into Psychoanalyst and of Taboo into Transference. But such a start itself depends upon an initial realization of the curiosity that Totem and Taboo represents, both as a book, and more particularly as a book by Freud, the first of Freud's full-length cultural works, and unmatched for gorgeous nonsense among them, until his last, Moses and Monotheism, a quarter century later. The origins of Totem and Taboo in Freud's work precede his 1907 essay on obsessive acts and religious practices, but Freud's reader needs to start with that essay's description of, and whenever I slow down a little, not enough, it will mean I'm quoting without saying I'm quoting, religion as a universal obsessional neurosis. in order to surmise some of the motives behind the excess that marks the book Totem and Taboo, published some 6 years later. Everything about this book, as of its direct descendant, Moses and monotheism, is marked by excess and by surprise, Freud's very own surprise, akin to the surprise Freud insisted he experienced at each fresh instance of the analytical transference. As with the book on Moses, Freud was more than hesitant about publishing Totem and Taboo, supposedly yielding only to the urgings of his disciples. Yet again, in regard to both books, Freud himself was unusually dogmatic, perhaps because the foundation of each was so palpably dubious. Is psychoanalysis itself only, or also, a universal transference neurosis? Unfair as the question must be, it can be posed cogently because of the curious juxtapositioning in Freud's work of two fundamental mythopoeic notions, taboo and transference, neither of which means what Freud precisely meant it to mean. Freud himself was totally obsessed with questions of priority, and since transference is the first of the two figurations in his work, an account of transference has to precede the story of the later tangles between the two in the month January 1912, when each figuration leaped to a first full formulation. The early Freudian uses of Übertragung, which is a German word translated as transference, which is of course the word for metaphorein, carrying across, metaphor. The early Freudian uses of Übertragung have surprisingly little to do with his matured sense of the term. The word transference in the Traumdeutung, the dream book, the interpretation of dreams, refers only to the process that enables unconscious ideas to enter the preconscious, a process of connection that Freud identifies as a transferring of intensity from the repressed to an idea already preconscious. Much more relevant to this later concept of analytical transference is what Freud called the false connection between patient and Freud himself, first described in the studies on hysteria. Yet even this seems more an allusion to what is there called a compulsion to associate than it is a proper symptom of what we might call a therapeutic eros. Historians of psychoanalysis accurately point to the postscript of the Dora case as the true start of the Freudian transference. Yet it is only a start if we examine the metaphor by which the transference is there represented. I must slow down. I'm always worried that there isn't enough time. This is a quotation from the postscript to the Dora case in the standard or straight-sheet version. What are transferences? They are new editions or facsimiles of the tendencies and fantasies which are aroused and made conscious during the progress of the analysis. But they have this peculiarity, which is characteristic for their species, that they replace some earlier person by the person of the physician. To put it another way, a whole series of psychological experiences are revived, not as belonging to the past, but as applying to the person of the physician at the present moment. Some of these transferences have a content which differs from that of their model in no respect whatever except for the substitution. This is still Freud, of course. These, then, to keep to the same metaphor, are merely new impressions or reprints. Others are more ingeniously constructed. Their content has been subjected to a moderating influence, to sublimation, as I may call it. Still Freud, of course. And they may even become conscious by cleverly taking advantage of some real peculiarity in the physician's person or circumstances and attaching themselves to that. And now the last sentence of this quotation, these then will no longer be new impressions, but revised editions. New editions, facsimiles, revivals, new impressions, reprints, but above all, revised editions. The anterior texts of the psyche retain so much priority in all of these that transference itself is devaluated. Indeed, the transference, the proper Freudian sense of the transference, has not yet come to its painful birth. To chart that birth, we need to abandon the writing of Freud for that of his most gifted single disciple, Ferenczi. who compelled his master to move on in transference theorizing by an audacious breakthrough in the year 1909. Surely no other paper by a psychoanalyst other than Freud himself was so repressively influential upon Freud himself. Ferenczi's great essay, Introjection and Transference, which you can get hold of very easily in a very nice Dover paperback reprint called Sex and Psychoanalysis. The essay is called Introjection and Transference by Ferenczi, Ferenczi, Hungarian Jewish devotee of Freud, available in a volume called Sex and Psychoanalysis, a Dover paperback reprint, quite inexpensively in print. Ferenczi's great essay, Introjection and Transference, begins by a pious citation from the postscript to Dora, but then proceeds rapidly to a marvelous leap that Freud himself would not take until 3 years later in January 1912. Nothing that Freud had written up to the year 1909 began even to associate the primal ambivalences and emotive confusions of the Oedipal conflict with the vicissitudes of the analytical transference. It was reserved for Ferenczi to state this true connection, while carefully, indeed anxiously, paying tribute to Freud on a just about every other paragraph basis throughout. And I will now give you a rather long quotation from Ferenczi. With the extraordinary significance that attaches, according to Freud's conclusion, which is confirmed daily, and so little vows are obligatory, I suppose, to the repressed Oedipus complex, hate and love towards the parents, in every case of neurosis, one is not surprised that the paternal air, the friendly and indulgent manner with which the physician has to meet the patient in psychoanalysis gets so frequently used as a bridge to the transference of conscious feelings of sympathy and unconscious erotic fantasies, the original objects of which had to be the parents. The physician is always one of those returners, as Freud says, in whom the neurotic patient hopes to find again the vanished figures of childhood. Nevertheless, one less friendly remark, reminding the patient of a duty or a punctuality, or a tone that is only a nuance sharper than usual, on the part of the analyzing physician, is sufficient to make him incur all the patient's hatred and anger that is directed against moralizing persons who demand respect and who were originally parent or husband. I'm still quoting Ferenczi. The ascertaining of such transferences of positive and negative affects is exceedingly important for the analysis. For neurotics are mostly persons who believe themselves incapable either of loving or of hating, often denying to themselves even the most primitive knowledge about sexuality. They are therefore either anesthetic or else good to a fault, and nothing is more suited to shatter their erroneous belief in their own lack of feeling and angelic goodness than having their contrary feeling currents detected and exposed in flagrante. Ferenczi is, in his grim way, a witty writer. I go on now with Ferenczi. The transferences are still more important as points of departure for the continuation of the analysis in the direction of the more deeply repressed thought complexes. And I will slow down here because of the extraordinary subtlety that Ferenczi is showing. Ridiculously slight resemblances also, the color of the hair, facial traits, a gesture of the physician, the way in which he holds a cigarette or a pen, the identity of the similarity and sound of the Christian name or that of some person who has been significant to the patient. Even such distant analogies as these are sufficient to establish the transference. The fact that a transference on the ground of such petty analogies strikes us as ridiculous reminds me that Freud himself, in the category of wit, showed the presentation by means of a detail to be the agent that sets free the pleasure, that is, reinforces the pleasure from the unconscious. In all dreams also, as Freud has said, we find similar allusions to things, persons, and events, but help with very minimal details. The poetical figure, part for whole, is thus quite current in the language of the unconscious. And I finish now this long quotation from Ferenczi. The sex of the physician is in itself a much-used bridge for the transference. Female patients very often attach their unconscious heterosexual fantasies to the fact that the physician is a man. This gives them the possibility of reviving the repressed complexes that are associated with the idea of masculinity. Still, the homosexual component that is hidden in everyone sees to it that men also seek to transfer to the physician their sympathy and friendship, or the contrary. It is enough, however, that something in the physician, this is the subtlest, I think, of Ferenczi's remarks that I'm quoting and ends this long quotation. It is enough, however, that something in the physician seems to the patient to be feminine, for women to bring their homosexual and men their heterosexual interest, or their aversion that is related to this, into connection with the person of the physician. Remarkable as these paragraphs were in themselves, at the time that they were written, 1909, when there was nothing in print on the transference, least of all by Freud himself, much more remarkable still is Freud's failure to have written them. What accounts for Freud's astonishingly long delay, 1895 to 1912, in actually formulating the psychoanalytic concept of the transference? And what, besides Ferenczi's catalytic intervention, made it possible for Freud to break through his own reservations or inhibitions and compose the 3 great essays on the transference, what I asked you to read for today, from 1912 to 1914. I'm sorry. The first clue to answering the second question, what made it possible for Freud to break through, comes in his 1911 notes on the visionary paranoid Dr. Schreber, in the extraordinary postscript, one of the great Freudian texts, where Freud broods upon his own mythological associations as set going by what he calls Schreber's delusional beliefs concerning the doctor's relation to the sun. That means, of course, not S-O-N, not Christ, but S-U-N, the natural sun. As Freud speculates on the sun as what he calls Schreber's sublimated father symbol, Freud, for the very first time in his entire work, cites the phenomenon of totemism. And then he links it in a footnote in his own early paper, which I've mentioned already, on obsessive acts and religious practices. This brief but absolutely crucial Freudian meditation upon the totem at the end of the Schreber case will lead directly to the writing of Totem and Taboo, a leading that, as I shall show, in turn liberated Freud into writing upon the transference as a hidden version of Taboo, and the Analyst as a hidden virtue, a hidden, that will intensify in the weeks ahead. And the Analyst as a version, V-E-R-S-I-O, version of totemism. The title page of the book, Totem and Taboo, carries as subtitle, Some Points of Agreement Between the Mental Lives of Savages and Neurotics. Should we not add to this subtitle, and between the therapeutic functions of totems and psychoanalysts? Freud's original September 1913 preface expresses much more confidence in his treatment of taboo than in his treatment of totem, and I quote from it now, so I know you've read this. The analysis of taboos is put forward as an assured and exhaustive attempt at the solution of the problem. The investigation of totemism does no more than declare that here is what psychoanalysis can, at the moment, contribute towards elucidating the problem of the totem. The difference, this is still Freud, is related to the fact that taboos still exist among us. Though expressed in a negative form and directed towards another subject matter, they do not differ in their psychological nature from Kant's categorical imperative, which operates in a compulsive fashion and rejects any conscious motives. This is the end of the quotation. Totemism, on the contrary, is something alien to our contemporary feelings, a religio-social institution which has been long abandoned as an actuality and replaced by newer forms. The still existent form of taboo, Freud presumably thought of as the obsessional neurosis, just as those newer forms of a religio-social institution would have primarily included the Roman Catholic Church in Austria. Or did Freud know, on whatever level of knowing, that his true model for taboo was already what he soon came to call the transference neurosis, and that the truly contemporary replacement for Totem and for Bishop had to be the Freudian psychoanalyst? Certainly Totem and Taboo's first essay, The Horror of Incest, is untroubled by such possibilities, and the reader encountering it now may well wonder what function it can possibly fulfill in the text of the book Totem and Taboo. Its two fundamental concerns, totemism and incest, seem yoked together not so much by textual violence as by what you might call textual yearning. and the totem at first appearance seems already to be a metaphor not so much for the phallic father or for a Nietzschean ancestor god as for Freud himself in proper person, as the founder of a therapy and a doctrine, as the ancestor of the psychoanalytic clan. How aware was Freud of the apposite and sardonic humor of this metaphor? And I'm now about to quote a delicious passage from Freud, and my commentary after it, as I said, began the process of near-lynching in both those talks to a psychoanalytical congress. Now this is Freud. In the first place, the totem is the common ancestor of the clan. At the same time, the totem is their guardian spirit and helper, who sends them oracles and, if dangerous to others, recognizes and spares its own children. Conversely, the clansmen are under a sacred obligation, subject to automatic sanctions, not to kill or destroy their totem, and to avoid eating its flesh or deriving benefit from it in other ways. This is still Freud. The totemic character is inherent, not in some individual animal or entity, but in all the individuals of a given class. And in a great sense, still Freud. From time to time, festivals are celebrated, at which the clansmen represent or imitate the motions and attributes of their totem in ceremonial dances. Translate experimentally the word totem here by the name Freud, and the clan as the psychoanalytic profession, and the passage takes on some very dark overtones in regard to such clansmen as Adler and Jung, who had quite recently violated their sacred obligation. There are also delicious nuances as to psychoanalytic festivals, where the more loyal clansmen perform their representative and imitative ceremonial dances. More interesting even than these interpretive possibilities are those sinister oracles, dangerous to others but amiable to the clan. How are we to translate what Freud goes on to describe as the totemic characteristic that most engrosses psychoanalysis? Here I quote him again. In almost every place where we find totems, we also find the law against persons of the same totem having sexual relations with one another and consequently against their marrying. We could say, this is me, not Freud, modifying Hamlet, that this law is almost more honored in the breach than in the observance, except that Freud may have shifted his perhaps unconscious metaphor here, so that the focus has moved from the vicissitudes of the analytic clan onto the social tact of the analytic transference. Freud, I think, should have called the chapter not the horror of incest, but something like the interest of incest, because it is both the aesthetic piquancy and analytic centrality of incest that dominates, as Freud concludes by noting, quote, the writings of Otto Rank, then of course his secretary and all but adopted son, later of course to be one more heretic, the writings of Otto Rank, which have brought more and more evidence to show the extent to which the interest of creative writers centers round the theme of incest, and how the same theme, in countless variations and distortions, provides the subject matter of poetry. That's the end of that quotation. Shelley, of course, had once called incest the most poetical of circumstances. But by poetical, Shelley meant something more than emotional ambivalence, which is precisely what informs the great Freudian reduction that is the Oedipal conflict. Such reduction is vital to the second chapter of Totem and Taboo, which we will discuss either later today or next week. That superb essay, Taboo and Emotional Ambivalence, which I think is Freud at his strongest, but also at his uncanniest. What Coleridge once called holy dread, the famous poem Kubla Khan, is also Freud's holy dread. When Freud darkly declares that taboo prohibitions have no grounds and are of unknown origin. Freud asks why we should concern ourselves with the riddle of taboo, but he evades an answer by again falling back upon what I would call that red herring of the Kantian categorical imperative as our supposed version of taboo. But the clues, the actual clues, conceptual and textual or verbal, make Freud's actual design quite transparent. As he approaches taboo, Freud cites the angle of vision or stance of the psychoanalyst himself as being uniquely appropriate to judging the phenomenon of taboo. And now I quote from Freud. He, the analyst, has come across people who have created for themselves individual taboo prohibitions of this very kind, and who obey them just as strictly as savages obey the communal taboos of their tribe or society. If the analyst were not already accustomed to describing such people as obsessional patients, he would find taboo sickness a most appropriate name for their condition. It's the end of the quotation. But would the analyst also find taboo sickness to be an appropriate name for that artificial illness, as Freud once called it, the transference neurosis? A certain anxiety about the very word transference, Übertragung, in this context clearly drips through Freud's text, and I want to catch one of those moments now in quoting it. This is Freud. Obsessional patients behave as though the impossible persons and things were carriers of a dangerous infection liable to be spread by contact onto everything in their neighborhood. I have already drawn attention to the same characteristic capacity for contagions and transference in my description of taboo. We know, too, that anyone who violates a taboo by coming into contact with something that is taboo becomes taboo himself, and that then no one may come to contact with him. And then a fascinating transition in Freud, which I can trace all through the text of Totem and Taboo, and I've looked at the manuscripts in London where there's even more evidence of this, but here it is right in the final text. This is still Freud. I will now put side by side two instances of the transference, or, as it is far better to say, the displacement of a prohibition. That is to say, having set up this strange link between taboo and transference, Freud now wishes to drive them apart even linguistically. Yet, this is myself now, not Freud, yet transference keeps coming back as Freud develops the relations between emotional ambivalence and the obsessions of undoing and what he calls the touching phobia. An extraordinary passage, which we will not analyze until later today or perhaps a week from today, but I think it's the most important passage in the second chapter of Totem and Taboo. An extraordinary passage, prophetic of the mutual contamination of the ideas of defense and the drive in the later Freud. We will see that particularly, of course, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle and so forth. This passage serves in this essay as a bridge to the transferences and extensions of the concept of taboo, and I will read this passage, trying not to read it too fast or too slow. As a result of the repression which has been enforced, and which involves a loss of memory and amnesia, the motives for the prohibition, which are conscious motives, and the conscious prohibition, nevertheless, in some sense, these motives remain unknown, and all attempts at disposing of it by intellectual processes must fail, since they cannot find any basis of attack. The prohibition owes its strength and its obsessive character precisely to its unconscious opponent, the concealed and undiminished desire. That is to say, to an internal necessity inaccessible to conscious inspection. And this next is what I would emphasize in this passage. The ease with which the prohibition can be transferred and extended reflects a process which falls in with the unconscious desire and is greatly facilitated by the psychological conditions that prevail in the unconscious. The instinctual desire, and this is one of those few moments where I must admit that Strachey goes wrong. The German there is Triebhafte. But Triebhaft, I don't know an English version of Helene. Drive-like, drive-ly, we haven't got a word for it in English. Drive-like is not right. The Triebhafte, here translated as instinctual desire, is constantly shifting in order to escape from the impasse and endeavors to find substitutes. Substitute objects and substitute acts in place of the prohibited ones. And then I find this next sentence fascinating, and I ask you to keep it in mind because we must come back to this. In consequence of this, the prohibition itself shifts about as well and extends to any new aims which the forbidden impulse may adopt. Any fresh advance made by the repressed libido is answered by a fresh sharpening of the prohibition. And then he uses a great phrase, which I would use the old Roman trope of contamination. The mutual inhibition, or as I would say, contamination, of the two conflicting drives or forces produces a need for discharge, for reducing the prevailing tension, and to this may be attributed the reason for the performance of obsessive act. Now, you can't really take that into the ear, as I am well aware, so I will comment on it now. This intricate paragraph packs into itself everything that I find most problematic about Totem and Taboo. But I want now to isolate from it only a single emphasis, leaving the rest of the discussion, and that emphasis is absolutely between the lines, as the late Leo Strauss would have said. And this is essentially a kind of, I don't know what to call it, it's not strictly speaking rhetorical or even Straussian analysis I'm about to perform. Notice that strength and obsessiveness alike in this paragraph. The qualities of strength and obsessiveness are ascribed as a doublet, what in rhetoric would be called the doublet, to taboo and to neurosis, whereas the doublet of weakness and randomness conversely belong to intellectual processes which cannot hope to diminish unconscious desire. These of what Freud calls transference and extension therefore are assigned to the emotional ambivalences of taboo and neurosis. Therefore, implicit throughout the passage is the strong hint that strength to combat strength must be found in the taboo's own transferences and obsessions, so as to turn taboo against taboo, so as to turn transference neurosis against obsessional neurosis. It is thus no accident that Freud suddenly makes the leap from taboo to totem, anticipating what will become the fourth essay in the book, The Return of Totemism in Childhood, which we are compelled to read, I think, as a barely concealed study of psychoanalysis itself, and I want to quote the bridging passage here. The most ancient and important taboo prohibitions are the two most basic laws of totemism: not to kill the totem animal, and to totally avoid sexual intercourse with members of the totem clan of the opposite sex. These, then, this is still Freud, must be the oldest and most powerful of all human desires. The wording of these two taboos and the fact of their concurrence will remind anyone acquainted with the findings of psychoanalytic investigations on individuals of something quite definite, which psychoanalysts regard as the center point of childhood wishes and as the nucleus of neuroses. He doesn't say so, but he means, of course, that masterpiece of emotional ambivalence, the so-called Oedipal conflict. And I'm now, in effect, obviously trying to show you that there are three masterpieces of emotional ambivalence in Freud, and they are in the end an identity, and they are the so-called Oedipal complex, the taboo, and, alas, the analytical transference itself. All intensities of ambivalence are at the center of neuroses. Then the Oedipal intensities of ambivalence in the taboos can be summoned up as an opposing power. How? The path of the transference is sketched in a cento, that is to say, I'm taking now three passages scattered through the next few pages of this essay and running them together. A slightly illegitimate device, but in high points, an element of the text, as I think you'll instantly see. I'm going to read three brief paragraphs by Freud. The linkage is mine, not his. This transmissibility of taboo is a reflection of the tendency on which we have already remarked for the unconscious drive in the neurosis to shift constantly along associated paths onto new objects. And now, after a break which I have made, if the violation of a taboo can be made good by atonement or expiation, which involve the renunciation of some possession or some freedom, this proves that obedience to the taboo injunction meant in itself the renunciation of something desirable. And finally, another passage, another page further on, the magical power that is attributed to taboo is based on the capacity for arousing temptation. And it acts like a contagion, because examples are contagious, and because the prohibited desire in the unconscious shifts from one thing to another. Now watch that verbal translation, which is good enough on Strachey's part, but that constant shifting about, which is like that mutual inhibition which I call the contamination, which I think we will find some 5 weeks or so hence, has to do with what seems to me the deepest complexity in all of Freud, which is that in the late Freud, I at least cannot tell the difference between what he is calling a drive and what he is calling a defense. The two notions have so deeply contaminated or mutually inhibited one another that they have, as it were, transformed the nature of the other. But not to jump ahead and now to go back to commenting on this cento of passages that I've just quoted to you. The reader who experiments by substituting the phrase analytical transference every time the word taboo appears in that cento will do only very scarce violence to Freud's own text. Towards the end of the curiously repetitive discourse that follows, and always watch Freud when he seems to lose momentarily his customary stylistic mastery. I think it's always a sign that he has just pulled something off, and he is exhibiting a certain complex anxiety about it. Towards the end, because he's a powerfully expressionistic writer, something that I think we frequently forget. He's one of the great German expressionistic writers. Perhaps the greatest. Towards the end of the curiously repetitive discourse that follows, Freud abruptly ceases from analogizing taboo and neurosis and seeks instead what you would expect in so great an analytical mind, to state the difference rather than the analogy. And this is his statement of the difference. But after all, taboo is not a neurosis, but a social institution. I'm quoting Freud, mind you. We are therefore faced with the task of explaining what difference there is in principle between a neurosis and a cultural creation such as taboo. That is that quotation. But the difference, whether in principle or in particle, excuse me, my dear, simply does not show up in Freud's subsequent discussion. In neurosis, Freud tells us there is a preponderance of the sexual over the social Triebhafte, drive-like elements. But the very next sentence reminds us that the social drives have their erotic components also. That Freud is in pursuit of much larger quarry is suddenly made apparent in one of his most extraordinarily aggressive declarations, and let it be said to his honor that he is surely the most aggressive writer of the 20th century. I mean, poor little thing, as I am constantly accused by my rabblement critics of being excessively aggressive, and the mildest of cream puffs compared to this master. Let me quote this astonishing paragraph. The neuroses exhibit on the one hand striking and far-reaching points of agreement with those great social institutions, art, religion, and philosophy. But on the other hand, the neuroses seem like distortions of them. Notice that the striking and far-reaching points of agreement are exhibited, but that the distortions of art, religion, and philosophy are merely a seeming. I go back to quoting him and not commenting upon him. It might be maintained that a case of hysteria is a caricature of a work of art, that an obsessional neurosis is a caricature of a religion, and that a paranoiac delusion is a caricature of a philosophical system. That is that quotation. But that great social institution as it has now become, psychoanalysis. Might it not be maintained that a transference neurosis is a caricature of psychoanalysis? Or perhaps if not a caricature, perhaps a transference neurosis is psychoanalysis. Freud would have frowned very darkly upon the question. But then in 1912, psychoanalysis was not yet a major social and cultural institution. Nearly 70 years later, you can see that I wrote this a year and a half ago originally, Freud's own patterns of displacement and transference seem much clearer. Art, religion, and philosophy all have their taboos, and so does psychoanalysis, which names it not as the displacement, but as the transference, the carrying across or metaphor that sometimes even substitutes itself for the entire therapeutic process that is Freud's legacy. Freud actually did think that religion was nothing but an obsessional neurosis. Freud actually did think that philosophical systems scarcely could be distinguished from paranoiac delusions. Freud's ambivalence towards the art of literature precluded his confusing a poem and a mere case of hysteria, except that if a poem ever attempted to be taken as more than what Freud called a beneficent illusion, Freud would have called that attempt an hysteria. Precisely such an attempt, of course, was the program of what we call romantic poetry, which sought to assert the power of imagination or creative mind over what, say, John Milton had called the universe of death, the natural world. But precisely that power Freud deprecated from at least 1909 on as what he called the omnipotence of thoughts, and that in turn he said was the greatest of narcissistic delusions. The uneasy third chapter of Totem and Taboo, Animism, Magic, and the Omnipotence of Thoughts, centers on the genesis of this supposed delusion. Freud begins with the assertion that the human race has developed what he calls three comprehensive systems of thought. I'm quoting now. Three great pictures of the universe. One, animistic or mythological. Two, religious. Three, scientific. Animism Freud defines most basically by following Hume. He quotes Hume here. There is a universal tendency among mankind to conceive all beings like themselves, and to transfer to every object those qualities with which they are familiarly acquainted and of which they are intimately conscious. The end of that Jungian quotation. Yet Freud is not interested in the natural history of animism, or even in magic, which he says is supposedly the animistic mode of thinking, but only in obsessional neurosis and in the uncanny tendency of obsessional neurosis towards the omnipotence of thoughts. Animism, according to Freud, is nothing less than the earliest version of obsessional neurosis, and shares therefore in what Freud powerfully says is the center of obsessional neurosis, the fear of death. The very next phase, Freud insists, is religious, where men transfer their belief in the omnipotence of their thoughts to the gods, and thus do not abandon their own narcissistic overestimation of themselves. When Freud goes on to state the third phase as being scientific, we know that he means his science, which is to replace Christianity and Judaism, even as they, in his view, superseded animism. What abides, even in this third phase, of the narcissistic overestimation of psychical acts is, and I quote Freud, it's a marvelous statement, the state of being in love, which is the normal prototype of the psychosis. That's a very great sentence. The state of being in love, which is the normal prototype of the psychosis. I stop quoting now. Art, like love, is then added to this archaic survival, and Freud proceeds to conclude his third chapter by hinting that love, at least, must be renounced in certain restrictions that make possible what he calls difficult or responsible work. Now, obviously, he means analytic work, therapeutic work. Again, the prohibitions that may be invoked in psychoanalytic work are darkly prefigured in the patterns of Taboo. And I come to the heart of this, but it is chapter 4, and I certainly hope we'll return today to look at this mad text together. The return of totemism in childhood, and I would add, the return of totemism in analysis. It is chapter 4, which is the true center not only of this book and of the analytical transference, but indeed, I think, in some sense, of all Freud's work. After 2 sections of the merest shadow boxing, half-heartedly summarizing the whole supposed range of theories of totemism, Freud forcefully considers animal phobias, demonstrating the displacement of fear from the father onto the animal. Ambivalence, fearing castration, substitutes. Brilliant formula. Ambivalence in the child, fearing castration by the father, substitutes an animal for the father. This is the formula. It is grimly persuasive, and Freud is very quick to relate it to the Oedipal conflict, and I quote now from this. If the totem animal is the father, then the 2 principal ordinances of totemism, the 2 taboo prohibitions which constitute its core, not to kill the totem, and not to have sexual relations with a woman of the same totem, coincide in their content with the 2 crimes of Oedipus, who killed his father and married his mother, as well as with the 2 primal wishes of all children, the insufficient repression or the reawakening of which forms the nucleus of perhaps every psychoneurosis. Who among Freud's readers, and I think this is an important rhetorical question, and I invite you to look at this point in the text, because you can locate it very quickly. It's on pages 141 to 143 of our editions of Totem and Taboo, and read this along with me as I read it out loud. Who among Freud's readers in the year 1912 could have anticipated the astonishing leap from this to the extraordinary story compounded out of the myths of the totem meal and the primal horde? Here are these central passages, I've made a cento again, as you'll see, of Freud's most extravagant invention. I said pages 141 to 143. Start at 141. One day the brothers, who had been driven out, came together, killed and devoured their father, and so made an end of patriarchal horde. Do I have the wrong pages there? Yes. United, they had the courage to do and succeeded in doing what would have been impossible for them individually, and then I skipped. The totem meal, which is perhaps mankind's earliest festival, and by the way, if you compare Strachey's English here, with Freud's extraordinary eloquence in the German, you will see how contra Bettelheim Strachey is a remarkable translator, because he catches the extraordinary intensity that Freud has here. The Totem meal, which is perhaps mankind's earliest festival, will thus be a repetition and a commemoration of this memorable and criminal deed. It's marvelous in English. A repetition and a commemoration of this memorable and criminal deed. I admit it sounds a bit like Lord Macaulay in one of his perorations, but it's very good late Victorian prose. And Freud was a great late Victorian, which was the beginning of so many things, of social organization, of moral restrictions, and of religion. That's a shocker, of course. I jumped ahead. The tumultuous mob of brothers were filled with the same contradictory feelings which we can see at work in the ambivalent father complexes of our children and our neurotic patients. They hated their father, who presented such a formidable obstacle to their craving for power and their sexual desires, but they loved and admired him too. After they had got rid of him, had satisfied their hatred, and had put into effect their wish to identify themselves with him, the affection which had all this time been pushed under was bound to make itself felt. It did so in the form of remorse. A sense of guilt made its appearance, which in this instance coincided with the remorse felt by the whole group. I'm speeding up because I hope you have the text in front of you, and I'm worried about all the time I'm using up this last lecture. The dead, and this is a great phrase also. I mean, this is almost Nietzsche in English as well as Freud in English. Blessed Strachey. This is beautiful writing. The dead father became stronger than the living one had been. How can one forget that as an English phrase? Let Bettelheim do better. The dead father became stronger than the living one had been. For events took the course we so often see them follow in human affairs to this day. What had up to then been prevented by his actual existence was thenceforward prohibited by the sons themselves in accordance with the psychological procedures so familiar to us in psychoanalysis under the name of deferred obedience. They revoked their deed by forbidding the killing of the totem, the substitute for their father, and they renounced its fruits by resigning their claim to the women who had now been set free. Excuse me. They thus created out of their filial sense of guilt the two fundamental taboos of totemism, which for that very reason inevitably corresponded to the two repressed wishes of the Oedipus complex. Whoever contravened those taboos became guilty of the only two crimes of which primitive society concerned itself. So that ends that astonishing, at least my concern with that incredible passage. Let me give you a rather strange piece of anthropological history. The great American anthropologist A.L. Kroeber, who was, by the way, the father of that fine fantasist and writer Ursula Le Guin. A.L. Kroeber, in 1939, was plagiarized by the great Lady Strauss, and I'm scandalized by this. He has one displaced footnote to Kroeber, but I'm going to read you a long translation from the English translation of a crucial work of Levi Strauss, which, if you run alongside of Kroeber's 1939 article, is clearly a crib from Freud. But that isn't important. The important thing is the powerful point against Freud which is being made here. First by Kroeber, and then by Levi Strauss. A.L. Kroeber, that's K-R-O-E-B-B-R. She is after Ursula K. Kroeber-Leguin. A.L. Kroeber, in 1939, reflected that the book Totem and Taboo was at most the representation of a prevalent human dream or nightmare. A reflection developed by Levi Strauss following Kroeber into this damaging verdict upon Freud's primal history scene. As I say, I'm now going to quote from the standard translation of Levi Strauss, but this is Kroeber's point. So Levi Strauss makes it very strongly. I'll read this fairly quickly because it seems to me a simple point, and when I reach the crucial part of it, I'll slow down. The failure of the book Totem and Taboo, far from being inherent in Freud's proposed design, results rather from Freud's hesitation to avail himself of the ultimate consequences implied in his premises. Freud ought to have seen that phenomena involving the most fundamental structure of the human mind could not have appeared once and for all. They are repeated in their entirety within each consciousness, and the relevant explanation falls within an order which transcends both historical successions and contemporary correlations. Ontogenesis does not reproduce phylogenesis, or the contrary. Both hypotheses lead to the same contradictions. One can speak of explanations only when the past of the species constantly recurs in the indefinitely multiplied drama of each individual thought, because it is itself only the retrospective projection of a transition which has occurred, because it occurs continually. And now I end this thing from Levi Strauss, where he makes Kroeber's point very powerfully. As far as Freud's work is concerned, this timidity leads to a strange and double paradox. Freud successfully accounts not for the beginning of civilization, but for its present state. That's a very fine point. Let me repeat that. Freud successfully accounts not for the beginning, not for the origin of civilization, but for its present state. And Freud, setting out to explain the origin of a prohibition, actually succeeds in explaining, certainly not why incest is consciously condemned, but how it is that incest is unconsciously desired. It has been stated and restated, he doesn't say it by Kroger at this point, but it was Kroger who first said it, that what makes Totem and Taboo totally unacceptable as an interpretation of the prohibition of incest and its origins is the gratuitousness of the hypothesis of the male horde and of primitive murder, a vicious circle deriving the social state from events which presuppose the social state. Again, a very powerful and irrefutable point. A vicious circle deriving the social state from events which presuppose the social state. That's the end of that quotation. But why did Freud invent the gratuity, this astonishing gratuity, this insupportable hypothesis of the male horde and of primitive murder? This is quite a different and perhaps less important question than why, once invented, the Freudian dialectics of taboo and totemism treat Freud himself to formulate the transference neurosis for the first time. By the way, I haven't told you something I'm too much taking for granted. The interesting fact, which is not in itself conclusive, but is very interesting, that in January 1912, on the same desk, on the same day, side by side, Freud was writing what became Chapter 2 of Totem and Taboo, Taboo and Emotional Ambivalence, and the 1912, the first essay called in English, The Dynamics of Transference. And so he knew what he was doing, even if he and his exegetes then concealed it from us. The totemic system, as Freud conceived it, is a covenant with a surrogate father, in which the surrogate's protection, care, and indulgence is exchanged for the child's obedience to the taboo, so that the father, once triumphed over, will now prevail over all ambivalences. The longing for the father, and I want to contrast this towards the end today with that beautiful passage, more beautiful than any Christian or Jewish passage I know of, longing for the father, that culminates the Valentinian gospel of truth. The longing for the father, the root of all religion, as Freud insists, confers upon the totem the authority that Freud himself possesses, and which Freud seeks for his analytical followers, not of course in regard to their father, who happens to be himself, but certainly in regard to their sons and daughters, their patients. When Freud reaches his conclusion, and insists that, as I've said to you already, the beginnings of religion, moral society, and art converge in the Oedipus complex, we can wonder legitimately why he does not add psychoanalysis to that list of beginnings. We have made the crossing to the dynamics of the transference, and I'm going to leave the cross and take you to those essays very quickly, to the dynamics of the transference, when Freud moves towards a formula that will allow the analyst's unconscious to interpret the ambivalences of the patient's unconscious. And you'll find this on pages 156 and 159. Psychoanalysis has shown us that everyone possesses in his unconscious mental activity an apparatus which enables him to interpret other people's reactions, that is, to undo the distortions which other people have imposed on the expression of their feelings. Now, that's the linking point. Now I come to the three essays on the transference, and then rather quickly I'll come to the end of this, and we will work with text. The 1912 essay on the dynamics of the transference is, as we should now expect, one of Freud's most curious and reticent theoretical performances, again requiring a certain reading between the lines, particularly as regards its relationship to Ferenczi, who receives only one rather displaced reference, as we will see, towards the end of the text. Freud begins by saying that his subject is almost inexhaustible, but that he seeks merely to clarify the inevitability of transference in analysis. And this quality of the inescapable immediately is found in the exercise of every individual's capacity to love. The neurotic individual, whose passion for transference, Ferenczi has so eloquently described, the neurotic individual is now viewed as being very susceptible indeed. And you get a very rather funny sentence, makes us squirm a little. Expectant libidinal impulses will inevitably be roused in anyone whose need for love is not being satisfactorily gratified in reality by each new person coming upon the scene. And it is more than probable that both parts of the libido, the conscious and the unconscious, will participate in this attitude. End of the quotation. In one of those agile leaps that I think most powerfully characterize his authentic genius, Freud, what I'm going to complain about is, you see, Freud surprisingly is able to devote his entire paper to the transference itself, and not to the patient. The status of the patient is thoroughly devaluated throughout. That is to say, it is after all a human phenomenon. It may be an illusory love, but it is still human. The patient is after all a being, a person. But Freud throughout talks about the transference and not about the patient. Partly, I think, this is because Freud is driving very hard for authority. But partly also his suddenly overt theory of the transference is being informed covertly by what I would call the principle of redundancy or overload, rhetorical and dialectical, that has dominated all of Totem and Taboo. For what? According to this paper, The Dynamics of the Transference, what are the stigmata of the transference? Why? That it is marked by excess in character and degree over what is rational and justifiable. Once he has stated this excess, Freud ponders three grand questions. One, why is this excess so much greater under analysis? Two, why does it provide the strongest resistance to the cure? Three, why does a bulk free association revive when the analyst is indeed the subject of the patient's repressed thought and emotion? Freud answers that first question, why is this excess so much greater under analysis, very unconvincingly. He simply denies it. He answers the second question, why does it provide the strongest resistance to the cure, by invoking the infantile imagos, and by demonstrating forcefully that any return of these from repression must both provoke resistance and appear as resistance. But the third question I want to center on, why does bulk-free association of the patient revive when the analyst is indeed the subject of the patient's repressed thought and emotion? This third question, which marks, I think, the true scandal of the transference, Freud does not answer. He evades it. And he passes instead into the supposed distinction, which I think is completely fake, between positive and negative transference. Precisely where Freud stops pondering and insists that he must turn to analytical evidence is where his exegetes should always begin. I choose to begin with a question of my own, and again I nearly got lynched at this point, to which I shall return later. Has any other discipline or praxis in the whole history of human culture or society, has any other discipline or praxis dared the hubristic spiritual authority that psychoanalysis has usurped? Is this not the center of any meditation, in whatever intellectual context, upon the relationship of psychoanalysis to truth? Who but an analyst, in what after all is an erotic situation, as distinguished from a merely sexual situation, who but an analyst would so diminish the dignity of the other person by insisting that any silence or blockage absolutely must have the analyst himself as object? That a social, no, I'm dead serious. So as I say, at that point, I really felt I was in danger. That a social, this is a serious matter, and I'm not just being polemic, and I'm not just an opponent of psychoanalysis, and in the end I would put my reverence for Freud against anyone's. So it's an ambivalent reference, and I think it should be. That a social and professional institution has been erected upon so outrageous a presumption is the lasting tribute that Western history has paid to Sigmund Freud. The poet Yeats allows his hero Cahulan to proclaim, I make the truth. But that is the high romantic intensity of a fiction proceeding knowingly towards its own imminent death. How can we justify Freud's unanswered questions, which are not fictions, since they touch everywhere upon the pragmatics of human misery, both necessary human misery and unnecessary human misery? One truth about the transference rests upon the Freudian dynamics at their most rhetorically persuasive. as in the following passage, in its reduction of every positive transference to an ultimately sexual basis. Now, this is a long passage, and since you've read it, I will speed up as I read it. Not completely, but a little. I want to get out of this lecture. It may have been we could call it aneurystic error. Positive transference can then be divided further into such friendly, this is Freud. Positive transference can then be divided Positive transference can then be divided further into such friendly or affectionate feelings as are capable of becoming conscious, and the extensions of these in the unconscious. Of these last, analysis shows that they invariably rest ultimately on an erotic basis. Astonishing insight on his part and very troubling. And he goes on, so that we have to conclude that all the feelings of sympathy, friendship, trust, and so forth which we extend in life are genetically connected with sexuality and have developed out of purely sexual desires by an enfeebling of their sexual aim, however pure and non-sensual they may appear in the forms they take on to our conscious self-perception. This is still Freud. I'm certainly not making fun of this. I find this scary. To begin with, Freud says, we knew none but sexual objects. It's hard to argue with him on those grounds. Psychoanalysis shows us that those persons whom in real life we merely respect or are fond of may be sexual objects to us in our unconscious mind still. This is still Freud, very powerful. So the answer to the riddle is this, that the transference to the physician is only suited for resistance insofar as it consists in negative feeling or in the repressed erotic elements of positive feeling. And now Freud goes on, as we raise, and he means that good old Aufhebung, as we raise the transference by making it conscious, we detach only these two components of the emotional relationship from the person of the physician. The conscious and unobjectionable component of it remains and brings about the successful result in psychoanalysis. Insofar, we readily admit that the results of psychoanalysis rest upon a basis of suggestion. Only by suggestion we must be understood that which we, with Ferenczi, before Ferenczi finally gets dragged in, find that it consists of. Influence on a person through and by means of the transference manifestations of which he is capable. That ends that long quotation. But is there then a truly positive transference at all? This is me, not Freud, of course. Evidently not, since there cannot be a useful degree of resistance to be overcome without the heightened affect of ambivalence, or shall we not now accurately call it taboo, in the precise sense of the second chapter of Totem and Taboo. For taboo in Freud's sense is only another version of the agon, of the struggle between analyst and patient, between Freud and his reader, between Freud and anteriority, and ultimately between the later and the earlier Freud. And I want you to look now at the extraordinary closing sentences of the Dynamics of Transference, which you'll find on pages 114 to 115 of that little book on therapy and technique, which means that I can read these sentences a little more quickly. And if I don't get another sentence in here, soon there will be no Bloomian voice at all. This struggle, this is the very end, this is pages 114 and 50. This struggle, agon, between physician and patient, between intellect and the forces of the drive, between recognition and the striving for discharge. This struggle is fought out almost entirely over the transference manifestations, and then less Strachey again, because I could not translate the German at this point, catching that precise accent of almost heroic grandeur that Freud puts into it successfully, which reminds one that Freud in the end liked to think of himself, as he said, not merely as a physician, not even as a speculator, but as he said proudly, as a conquistador. This is the ground, marvelous again, Macaulay-like prose, this is the ground on which the victory must be won, the final expression of which is lasting recovery from the neurosis. It is undeniable that the subjugation of the transference manifestations provides the greatest difficulties for the psychoanalyst, but it must not be forgotten that they, and they only, render the invaluable service of making the patient's buried and forgotten love emotions actual and manifest, and then you get this very, very phrase, again beautifully rendered by the malign Strachey. For in the last resort, no one can be slain in absentia or in effigy. Who has Freud wished to conjure up that he may slay them? Surely in the first place the patient's parents. But truly Freud has reversed the pattern of the totem beast here And surely the Totem Analyst is now slaying the Primal Horde. I think that's as important a thing as I have to say in this rear lecture. How far are we here from what will become the second of the Transference essays, the paper on recollection, repetition, and working through of 1914? The difference, that is to say, the distance traversed, is principally in the boldness with which the 1914 essay sets forth that dismaying disease of love, the transference neurosis. This boldness is evident also in Freud's overt war against the past, and look at pages 162 to 163, where again you get this heroic rhetoric of the struggle. The past, and again, less stretchy, the past is the patient's armory, out of which he, the patient, fetches his weapons for defending himself against the progress of the analysis, weapons which we must wrest from him one by one. Against these weapons, Freud adopts as a final wresting technique what he calls magnificently and audaciously an artificial illness, the transference neurosis itself, darkly confirmatory of Karl Kraus's bitter jest, surely one of the two most profound things ever said about psychoanalysis, darkly confirmatory of Karl Kraus's bitter jest that psychoanalysis was the disease of which it purported to be the cure. The other one, by the way, is also good old Krauss, when he said, only the craziest parts of psychoanalysis are absolutely true. But okay, I go on now. I'm quoting from just this point in Freud. The main instrument, right at the end of the essay, and since we have the text, I will dash through this. The main instrument, however, for curbing the patient's compulsion to repeat, and for turning it into a motive for remembering, consists in the handling of the transference. We render it harmless and even make use of it by according it the right to assert itself within certain limits. And think of the width of this. Again, beautifully put by Strachey. We admit it into the transference as to a playground, in which it is allowed to let itself go in almost complete freedom, and is required to display before us all the pathogenic impulses hidden in the depths of the patient's mind. If the patient does but show, and I know that's very British, that's high Edwardian, but look how it works here. When a more contemporary style worked for Freud here, you see, I mean, Freud was a great Edwardian, stylistically, and in the way he lived. If the patient does but show compliance enough to respect the necessary conditions of the analysis, we can regularly succeed, keep the confidence of that, we can regularly succeed in giving all the symptoms of the neurosis a new transference coloring. And one remembers at that point, as Freud always knew, that the great Renaissance trope for trope itself is coloring, a color, a new transference coloring, and replacing his whole ordinary neurosis, and I love to scorn ordinary neurosis, by a transference neurosis. You see, a marvelous artificial illness which we've created laboratory conditions right here on our own couch, of which he can be cured by the therapeutic work. But what's that, of course? He can be cured of the artificial illness, not the merely real one. The transference, but Freud knows that, of course. Look what he does with this. The transference thus forms a kind of intermediary realm between illness and real life, through which the journey, and watch that metaphor, or trope, or the quest for a journey, from the one to the other must be made. The new state of mind has absorbed all the features of the illness. It represents, however, an artificial illness, that's that great phrase, which is at every point accessible to our interventions. It is at the same time a piece of real life. The German gets that even better. You hear, Freud's triumph there. But adapted to our purposes by especially favorable conditions, and, this is very important, it is of a traditional character. From the repetition reactions, which are exhibited in the transference, the familiar paths, and there is that notion of a journey and a quest again, lead back to the awakening of the memories, which yield themselves, and this is a little too optimistic, of course, but rhetorically it's beautifully done, without difficulty, after the resistances have been overcome. The end of that quotation. The transference neurosis, properly manipulated through interpretation, we are told here, will work through from repetition to true recollection, at least if we are to credit Freud's own design. But, at this point, my analytical audiences get furious again, but we have met the transference neurosis before, throughout the second chapter of Totem and Taboo, but under the name of Primal History and its ambivalences. Freud's anxieties about this hidden pattern both produce and vex the third and much the most remarkable of the transference essays. and if we don't get to talking about this today, we will next time, the very great one called Observations on Transference Love of 1915, a paper in which Freud justly took an especial pride, and a paper which, of course, radical feminists these days are furious about. Freud's overt center here is the female patient who falls in love with her analyst, but his true concern is the counter-transference of the analyst, which may interfere with the Freudian insistence, quote, that the psychoanalytic treatment is founded on truthfulness. Now, by the way, from this point on in his career, Freud promised annually to write a therapeutic essay for the disciples on the counter-transference. He never wrote it. He never could write it. He never would write it. And I hope that in the next 5 weeks, together we will figure out why. Fearful of jeopardizing his authority, Freud forgot how vulnerable his immediate formulations were. Is the transference, after all, true love? Is the book Totem and Taboo true? Freud wisely says that the analyst must neither fulfill nor suppress the patient's craving for love, while taking up a stance towards the patient's love for which there is no prototype in real life. I'm quoting there. Indeed, Freud's ideal analyst, and this is marvelous prose, must face the transference love boldly, but treat it like something unreal. This analyst, quote, proof against every temptation, close quote, is curiously like the biblical Joseph confronting Potiphar's wife, which prompts me to the irreverent wish that Freud had followed the grand injunction of Nietzsche's favorite author, Emerson, which goes, leave thy theory like Joseph his coat in the hand of the harlot and flee. Instead, Freud splashes into the swamps of love. That's my favorite phrase in this, but never mind. Instead, Freud splashes into the swamps of love. I was actually pissed for that. Attempting vainly to distinguish between transference love and normal love by the supposedly greater power of transference love to achieve results. And now I want you to look at page 179, which is a crucial passage in the third transference essay. A very startling paragraph upon the incredibly embattled stance of the analyst. A very great paragraph. Instantly puts this power absolutely into question. This is on page 179. The analytic psychotherapist thus has, here's that imagery which I think runs right through everything Freud writes on the transference. It's always battlefield, high, renaissance, agon, and struggle. The analytic psychotherapist thus has a threefold battle to wage. In his own mind, against the forces which would draw him down below the level of analysis. Outside analysis, against the opponents who dispute the importance he attaches to the sexual, here's that mad word, tree poplar again, drive-like forces and hinder him from making use of them in his scientific method, and in the analysis against his patients, who at first behave like his critics, but later on disclose the overestimation of sexual life which has them in thrall, and who try to take him captive in the net of their socially ungovernable passions. Very great passage. You'll be delighted to know I have just one more paragraph in this lecture, and then we will turn to discussion, and we will have time. However eloquent, this is rendered coherent only by its hidden reliance upon Freud's mythopoeia creation, Totem and Taboo. The forces of the counter-transference that might pull the analyst down are less those of Eros than of Thanatos, for they are the forces now internalized that destroyed the totem father. Outside opponents of psychoanalysis truly dispute not so much the sexual thesis as that of the primal history scene, perpetually repeated in the taboo restrictions that psychoanalysis itself insists upon placing upon the patient. Most crucially, the patients pass from their dark sources in the primal horde to the posture of the guilty brothers, for whom the slain ancestor has become a numinous shadow, loved with that fearful eros that only God and the gods provoke. The truth of the transference is the truth of primal ambivalence, no more, no less. And finally, of Freud's own primal ambivalence towards tradition. Now that ends that lecture, and I'm delighted to say that it hasn't taken a lot longer than I wanted, but we have time, my dears. Now, can I hear some questions, disputations, animadversions, reflections, if only so I could give me some breath before I plunge us more into text? My dear. Oh, yes. Oh, yes, 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 yes. In fact, if you look at the subsequent psychoanalytical literature, the usual, in fact, the more than archetypal essay, the invariable essay, no matter who writes it. And indeed, this is one of the areas in which, again, somewhat reluctantly, I will grant that Lacan has made one of his extraordinary, if in the end disconcerting, advances. In that he was willing to turn to this forbidden subject. Indeed, nobody else had been able to do very much with the account of transference. The ego psychologists, the interpersonal psychiatrists, the British Freudians always start by saying, well, Freud never wrote his essay on account of transference, and then they give you 4 or 5 truisms about it. But this missing essay, I mean, there are 2 missing essays in Freud. He also kept saying that he was going to write an essay on the supposed defense of sublimation. It's perfectly obvious why he never wrote an essay on the defense of sublimation. It's not a defense. It doesn't exist. Plato may have exalted it. Nietzsche may have desperately called for it. Freud might want to think that it was possible, but there isn't anybody in this room who has ever successfully sublimated. And let's face it, there is no such creature. There is no such entity. There is no psychic defense. We do not sublimate. We repress. We flee from, we evade, we estrange, we introject, we project, we undo, we go through the full paraphernalia of all those delicious defenses, but we do not sublimate. Therefore, he could not write and did not write the essay. He didn't want to admit that he couldn't sublimate. But he kept saying he was going to write that essay on the counter-transference. I think he couldn't do it. I think what took its place was that other painful late birth in his work. It took the transference so long to come to its belated and painful dark birth in him. It's very astonishing to watch that movement from a certain kind of gathering darkness to the so-called ego ideal and the terrible emergence of the most frightening of Freudian agencies or instances, the superego, the above I, the upper I. That thing, that entity, that agency or instance in us which behaves so abominably towards us that is confronted and which is Freud as perhaps his most powerful and enigmatic, which keeps battering at the ego of each one of us, something within us, something about us, something concerning us, which keeps battering at our ego, insisting that we surrender our aggressivity, and each time we make a further surrender of that aggressivity, instead of being appeased, it gets yet more ferocious and angry at us, and we feel more and more guilty about being aggressive when in fact we are less and less aggressive. I think that takes the place of the counter-transference in a very complex way, but for that we need more material and more work. We need to discuss more Freudian texts. Okay. This is Freud's own truth. This isn't me. The later Freud, eventually, that is to say, the Freud who replaces the earlier theory of the drives, which perhaps too simply, very powerfully said, a drive for ego preservation against libido or sexuality. But the later Freud, who invents that frightening thing called the death drive, and sets against libido or eros, the later Freud thought that the most primal of all the primal elements in us was ambivalence. And he traced it to what he called, and in English you could only get this with a slash mark, the fusion-diffusion of the drives. The fact that back at your origins, the drives of love and death tried to separate from one another, tried to fuse with each other, found they could neither separate nor fuse. Out of that endless agitation, Freud traces primal ambivalence, of which, as I say, though he would never say this, the 3 masterpieces, and obviously I'm being ironic, are the Oedipal conflict, the taboo, and the therapeutic or analytic transference. But of course it is that primal ambivalence which in later Freud, in the great book which in English is properly translated Inhibition, Symptoms, Anxiety, which we will spend a session reading before we are done with Freud, that primal ambivalence is also seen as being identical with anxiety itself, which is seen as taking priority over any possible stimulus to it, taken as being indeed primal. and is also related to primal repression, that astonishing Freudian category in which you are in flight from or evading something before there is anything to be in flight from or be evaded. Something's being repressed before there is anything to be repressed. That, too, is the work of what Freud would call primal ambivalence. If you look at the latest Freud, the obvious, the outline of psychoanalysis at the end, the work perhaps mistranslated as civilization and its discontents, maybe culture and its uncertainties, or what he would have done. If you look at the Freud of the late cultural work, like that crazy book, Moses and Monotheism, if you look at the Freud of that extraordinary essay on which I'm determined we will spend a lot of time reading it together, the great essay, which is the most fascinating single document in this book, Therapy and Technique, the essay in terminable and interminable, endable and unendable analysis, who knows what. The great summa that he writes towards the end in late 1937 or 1938, a powerful and despairing work. Prophetically, he cries out that he's been speaking to the winds, because every patient in the end, whether male or female, is at work refusing his or her cure from the analyst because of their excessive narcissistic attachment to their own fantasies. Or as I would say, and you wouldn't have liked my saying this, but I think it's true, it is what the romantic poets or critics or cultured people in general through the ages have called the imagination, which is, I think, identified, though this is disputable on my part, I know, in that great essay, Analysis, Terminable and Interminable, and being finally the insurmountable obstacle of Freud's really being able to cure his patients. But that too is a matter to be explored. What about the more direct pieces here, which, I repeat, does infuriate, I find? Look, let me give you an instance of this, even though my voice is beginning to fail. And I do want this, before we finish today, to have a last look, at Gnosticism by looking at a certain passage in the Gospel of Truth and contrasting it to Freud, and then briefly next time reconsidering Totem and Taboo and the Transference Neurosis, and then getting into the meat of the prophet, which I put on the board. But let me state something I find very interesting. I think that is a clue to something which is wrong about official studies of Freud. If you want the great encyclopedic work of what you could call orthodox or traditional Freudianism, those Freudians who went into exile and who in this country developed that much maligned school of ego psychology, you would take Otto Fenichell's great work, The Psychoanalytical Theory of the Neuroses, which alphabetically gives you a vast compendium of Freud's writings. If you want something more recent, reflecting, of course, well, most brilliantly, I think, reflecting the influence of the late Lacan, you would take, now also translated and easily available, the invaluable work called The Dictionary of Psychoanalysis by Laplanche and Fontaine. Yes, okay. Notice, I invite you to do something. Look at both works. You will find a lengthy, interesting, and useful, practically an essay, an entry, an expanded entry on transference in both works. Search through either for some mention of taboo, let alone totemism. Look at the index, ransack the book, it won't be mentioned. Both these major Freudian schools allow themselves to make a deep division, which Freud himself encouraged them to make, between what Freud called his cultural writings and his so-called scientific or medical or therapeutic writings. I am saying, look, do not fool yourself. From the start, but particularly from January 1912 on, there is no distinction between the so-called cultural writings and the so-called scientific or medical or therapeutic writings. Do not deceive yourself that the Freudian theory, including its cultural aspect and the Freudian praxis, are in any way divisible. What you have from the start is a very complex, I would not even call it a theory, because as many scientists and many philosophers and logicians have pointed out endlessly, it's wearisome that they keep demonstrating this, because let's take it for granted. It does not meet any of the tests for scientific theory whatsoever. All the data is cooked. It all comes out after all. Nothing could be more cooked than transference phenomena, obviously. We are not dealing with science, my dears. We are not dealing with philosophy. We are not dealing with scientific method. We are dealing with the most powerful cultural speculator to appear in the West, at least probably since then. Not a philosopher, though. not a scientist, not really a medical man. He insisted passionately that he was anything but a religious writer, that he was overtly an anti-religious writer. I have already said in print the paradox, which nobody's ever going to accept, that the J writer is in fact not a religious writer at all, and that Freud is nothing but a religious writer. That obviously involves one further paradoxes of all kinds. Still, he is a very powerful writer. And now I return to this notion of facticity. You know, the first time I plagued you with a lecture, and this was the last, I don't think my throat can take this sort of thing anymore. At least not until I feel stronger in the spring and my old age is set aside a little more. Freud has created an overwhelming facticity. I don't care how anti-Freudian you think you are or pro-Freudian. Whether you think you're an ego-psychologist or a Lacanian or not at all. Whether like the writers Nabokov and Borges, for instance, you are ignorantly and passionately anti-Freudian, as they both of them are. Doesn't matter. You are all Freudians. We are all Freudians. We cannot help it. We have no map of the mind, explicit or implicit, here in the year 1983, really, that works for us, to which we naturally resort, except Freud's rather complicated, and indeed quite self-contradictory map of the mind. As I remember saying in that opening lecture, even the most sophisticated among us, when we are the least bit tired, or we're exhausted most of the time, we really do go around thinking that somehow we are odd mechanisms with little boxes inside us, labeled id, or ego, or superego. No, but I'm not joking. We really do think of ourselves as some odd mingled drives of love and death. Now this is, of course, as Wittgenstein complained, a very powerful mythology. But the complaint is no good. It is our mythology. Forgive me, but it is. That is to say, I think we are now naturally Freudian, whether or not we think we are overtly anti or pro-Freudian, the way people used to be naturally Christian, or naturally Jewish, or perhaps naturally Muslim or Buddhist. I mean, this is the mind of our age. How that has happened, I find baffling and fascinating. I have not seen this traced. I have not seen this accounted for at all. Short of the triumph of various religious formulations, such as, for instance, the historical triumph of Christianity in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, and that, after all, was not just an intellectual phenomenon, that was a political and social and economic phenomenon, that was accomplished by force. This, though a somewhat social phenomenon, though a somewhat educational phenomenon, is essentially a cultural, and as it were, intellectual or quasi-intellectual phenomenon. Now, what are we to do with this? I do not know of so overwhelming a facticity that any of us are called upon to confront. Well, it obviously has to be read. And at this point, I enter a dissent. Reading with a capital R, as practiced by, the man I deeply love, Jacques Derrida, or Paul Damir, or any of my closest friends in this life, is a discipline dependent upon many, many complex strands, a very fascinating and powerful discipline. But in it there are certain crucial elements, such as a certain French-Swiss version of differential linguistics, such as the major tradition of German dialectical philosophy from Hegel to Heidegger on to somebody like Derrida and more recent figures. There is the great and improbable monolithic figure of Lacan, whose genius I cannot deny for a second, though to read him drives me wild. I cannot think of an author who has a more unsettling, and in the end, disabling effect upon me, which may be a reflection upon both of us, but I feel really infuriated. Nevertheless, all of these modes of reading Freud seem to me, I will not say beside the point, but they do not touch the point that I seek to address. How could this happen? What kind of a facticity is this? That is to say, I'm asking very different questions, it seems to me, than Lacan or Derrida, or Demon, or Laplanche, or Deleuze, or any ego psychology, or something in their tradition like Richard Wollheim, or an American sociologist like Reid. These are the people who have done in very different ways the best work on Freud. I'm not concerned with that. I'm concerned with a cultural triumph so overwhelming that it has changed the way we read everything else. And I don't mean the technical way we read, because in the end, I do not think that there are technical ways of reading. I sometimes really fear that we read the way we eat. You are what you read and you are what you eat. And it's a very complex matter, but it cannot be talked about as a linguistic problematic. Let's set that aside also. And of course, I'm playing on Freud's own myth of cannibalism in Totem and Taboo. But what I want us to look at in just the next 4 weeks, as we handle texts, Lordy, I'm not going to get to the Gospel of Truth, but at the very end, maybe I'll have an extra class and I'll try to go through all sorts of things I hope to do. But let's talk about this. We still have a little time left today. Look, you read Totem and Taboo and the Transference essays for today. What, after all, would be the major point? Admittedly, I have a peculiar and at times obscure mind. But if you had to say, having just endured, and thank you for being so patient, my cracked throat enunciating this lecture, what am I trying to show? What have I been up to in saying that there isn't really any difference between the 3 Transference essays and the book Totem and Taboo? That they're equally fantastic, equally fascinating, equally concerned with cultural issues, and yet equally concerned with actual therapeutic practice. That is to say that the return of totems in early childhood, that ghastly and powerful, that memorable and criminal deed, which is always being commemorated, that hideous and gratuitous, that unnecessary myth, which, as Freud says, gets everything backwards culturally, deducing, of course, from its effects in the wrong way around. What, after all, is that horrible, ghastly story of father murder, cannibalism, and subsequent remorse in the foundation of the supposed system upon it? What has that got to do with the analytic transference? On the surface, nothing. I've tried to show everything. They are simply 2 versions of the same thing. They are the same poem rewritten. What's the consequence of that? And the consequence is pretty unnerving. If you were a professional analyst, the consequence would be that by now you would have stopped listening to me. You would have said, get back to reading poems. Now, if you want to write about Wallace Stevens, write about Wallace Stevens. But let our Uncle Siggy alone. But you do not belong to that abominable profession. At least I don't think there's anybody in this room that belongs to that benighted profession. And there are always honorable exceptions. And handsome ones, too. Yes.
You say we're all in literature.
I grant you that point, and I go on.
The question is, why has literature been so smitten or so in a sort of iron grip of not psychology, but Freud in particular?
My dear, what is not literature now? Are we not in a literary culture? Which is another point that I made in that initial lecture on facticity. If you are in a time, as we are, where whether we like it or not, in the deepest and most public senses, it is perfectly fair to say, I'm afraid, that philosophy, religion, and even what used to be called science are in some deep sense, if not discredited, at least made irrelevant to what could be called the cultured mind. I mean, to find a serious theologian worthy of your respect in contemporary America or England or France or Germany is a mighty effort indeed. Philosophy, some of you will disagree with this, of course. I agree with my friend Richard Rorty. It seems deeply bankrupt. It has gotten itself into a terrible split and a terrible hole, and it certainly seems to be a long way from our cultural concerns. Let's not bother talking about what science has or hasn't done to us. When I say that a particular age, a particular culture becomes a literary culture, I'm frequently misunderstood about this. I'm not praising it. I think it's awful when a culture becomes a literary culture. I think a culture, whether 2nd century Alexandria, or the United States and the Western world in 1983, I think when a culture becomes a literary culture, it's because things are very bad indeed. And images take over. And then literature fights for its life against the manipulators of images who are, of course, not interested in literature. If we are now, and I think we are, willy-nilly, unfortunately, in a literary culture, and if Freud cannot be distinguished from that culture, he thought he could be, but that was, I think, a gross deception on his part. He is our greatest monument of what has turned into our literary culture. But I think we cannot distinguish our literary culture from Freudian culture. That is to say, I think Freudianism has become the culture that it purports to describe. I am, of course, twisting Karl Kraus and Peter Atkinson in that. He said psychoanalysis itself was the disease of which is reported to be the cure. I'm saying that the Freudian analysis of culture has become the culture which is purported to analyze. That is a terrible dilemma to find ourselves in.
In other words, that's why one can't go back to the
Yeah. That is to say, something has happened, which I think is highly unfortunate. I don't think Freud caused it. But I think that in an age which has been made so vulnerable to becoming a purely literary culture, at least for a while, nothing else seems to be in sight, then the strongest single writer of that age, a writer who I think is stronger than anyone except possibly Proust, and obviously he's more universal than Proust, of all the 20th century or later 19th century writers. That is to say, a writer who really does have the originality and unsettling force and persuasive power of the J writer, or of Shakespeare, or of the other great originals of Western culture. At this point, my throat is gone and time is almost up, but I welcome the question, and I don't pretend to have answered it, but go on. No.
not to take it personally, but unlike many literary analysis that are individual, your analysis, for instance, in the past few weeks, has been very critical.
Yes and no. Yes and no. I mean, that's very kind of you. You know, one of the jokes that I keep making almost obsessively in what I write, I made it so often even I am tired of it, is that what we call Freudian literary criticism is exactly like what they used to call the Holy Roman Empire. It wasn't Holy Roman, it wasn't an empire. It isn't Freudian, it isn't literary, it is criticism. I refuse to write Freudian literary criticism. It is garbage. I think you have to pick your way. I'm certainly not a Freudian, but I think you have to pick your way. Here is a terribly unsettling problematic. What are we to do with it? It lies at the center of that phenomenon that I would call, for want of a better term, and I hate the word because of facticity, contingency, brute factuality, that kind of originality which so imposes itself that you don't see how you ought to get up from under it, and yet you must keep trying. No, I'm not a Freudian, and I despise what is called Freudian literary criticism of any persuasion whatsoever. And I shiver whenever I see an essay called Freud and something, because the and something always disappears and Freud wins. He loads the dice, he wins, yes.
So isn't the whole idea, though, of overcoming or getting out from underneath ecstasy is a very Freudian notion? I mean, that's anxiety of influences.
I would like to think, a Nietzschean notion, but it is also undoubtedly Freudian. I would like to think that it is ultimately a Gnostic notion, which would make it somewhat different, or Kabbalistic, make it somewhat different from both Freud and Nietzsche, but that lies ahead of us. That's right.